Hi, Mr. C here. Okay, Freaky Tales from Far and Wide. Now, yesterday I read you a story from this book, The Gingerbread Man, and I told you that it would be a little bit different from the versions that you might have heard before. So, if you haven't listened to it yet, have a look on the channel and you'll see it there. It's well worth it. It's got a funny twist at the end. But today we're going to read a different story, and it's called The Mightiest Mouse That Ever Nibbled Fat. Okay? Once upon a time there lived a little grey mouse. More than anything else in the world, he wanted to be famous. So famous that people would still be talking about him in 1,000 years. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would climb up onto the roof of the hut where he lived, and he would lift up his little pink paws until it seemed that the moon was caught between them. "Look at me! Look at me!" he would shout. "I can hold the moon. I am the mightiest mouse that ever nibbled fat." One morning, the little mouse woke up in his nest under the shelf in a corner of the hut, and he saw that a terrible fire was blazing in the doorway of the hut. There was yellow light pouring in, and it was growing brighter with every moment that passed. The little mouse leapt to his feet and flicked his tail from side to side. "If I run through those flames and fetched water," he thought to himself, "then the world would know what a brave mouse I am." He closed his eyes and he ran. He ran into the fire. He ran through the flames and out of the door. And it wasn't hot. His fur wasn't burnt at all. He began to shout, "I'm the mightiest mouse that ever nibbled fat." Then he opened his eyes and looked over his shoulder. The terrible fire was nothing but the sunlight shining through the doorway. It was nothing but yellow sunshine. "Oh dear, perhaps the world is harder to please than I thought." Then he saw that in front of him there was a hill, a great yellow hill stretching high above his head. "If I jumped up to that hill in one bound," he thought to himself, "then the world would know what a powerful mouse I am." He closed his eyes and he jumped. He jumped with all his strength, and he landed fair and square on top of the hill. It wasn't far. His feet didn't hurt at all. He began to shout, "I'm the mightiest mouse that ever nibbled fat." Then he opened his eyes and looked over his shoulder. The great hill was nothing but a little heap of sand. It was nothing but a pan full of yellow sand. "Oh dear, perhaps the world is harder to please than I thought." Then he saw that in front of him there was a lake so wide that he could hardly see across the other side. "If I swam across that lake," he thought to himself, "then the world would know what a fearless mouse I am." He closed his eyes and plunged into the water. He swam across the wide lake. It didn't seem to take very long. When he reached the other side, he was tired, so he shook himself dry and lay down to sleep, thinking, "I'm the mightiest mouse that ever nibbled fat." When he woke up again, he opened his eyes and looked over his shoulder. The wide lake was nothing but a man's footprint full of muddy water. "Oh dear, perhaps the world is harder to please than I thought." He travelled on for a while until he saw something tall and thin. It looked like a great pole stretching up into the sky. "Ah!" the mouse thought to himself, "that must be the pole that holds up the sky. If I was to cut it down, then the whole sky would come crashing on top of us all, and the world would surely remember me for that." He closed his eyes and he began to nibble and gnaw at the foot of the pole. He nibbled and gnawed until it toppled and fell. It didn't take long. "I'm the mightiest mouse that ever nibbled fat." He put his paws over his ears and waited for the sky to come down, but nothing happened. He opened one eye and then the other. He looked up and the sky was as blue and high as it had always been. He looked over his shoulder, and the great pole was nothing but a tall blade of grass lying on the ground. Oh dear, perhaps the world is harder to please than I thought. And he continued his journey. Then he saw a mountain, a grey mountain with snowy crags reaching high into the clouds. If I was to move that mountain, he thought, then surely the world would never forget me. It took him many days travelling over the tundra to reach that mountain. It took him many weeks to dig around it with his little claws. It took him many years to carry the mountain grain by grain, pebble by pebble, stone by stone, from there to here. It took him many, many, many years to shift that whole mountain to where it is now. And when it was finished, the little mouse rubbed his eyes and looked over his shoulder. Yes, it was a mountain, and the people called it Mouse Mountain, and they gathered round him and said, "You are the mightiest mouse that ever nibbled fat." That was 1,000 years ago, and they're talking about him still. And so am I. Wow, what an amazing story. And you remember he kept saying that perhaps it's harder to please than I thought. He said, "Oh dear, perhaps the world is harder to please than I thought." And he continued his journey. And yes, it is. It is much, much harder to please the world than you think. And what he did at the end was a mighty, mighty task, wasn't it? He did move a whole mountain. Well, that's what the Inuits believe. And the Inuits are often what we call Eskimos. And they live way, way, way away. Okay? So that's the end of that story. Next story we're going to read is a fantastic one. It's called Winter and Summer. Okay? So that's goodbye from the Freaky Tales, and it's goodbye from Mr. C. Take care. Bye!